All right, welcome everybody to our next video here for the 160th Chancellorsville Live. I am Kris White, Chris Mackwoski beside me. Behind me is Dan Davis. We are actually going to do something a little bit different. You may have seen our Shiloh driving tour and our Gettysburg driving tour with Gary Edelman and Tim Smith of the West. So what we're going to do here at Chancellorsville 160, and you may have seen this already in our first video, we're going to drive a little bit around this battlefield. This is a huge battlefield that most people don't give it credit for. I mean, from where we're sitting over to Fredericksburg to the east to my right, that is 10-ish miles. Chancellorsville itself sits about 1.5 miles to my left, out to the west. Behind me to the south, about 12 miles to the south, is Spotsylvania Courthouse, and then to the north will be the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers in various different stages around us, from about 3 miles to just a little bit over 1 mile from where we're sitting. So this is a huge battlefield, so we want to give you a little bit of an experience, and we're actually starting from the first day at Chancellorsville. You better have watched our earlier video about the first day at Chancellorsville, because this is going to tie into that right now. And we're going to go take a drive to one of the most famous meetings of the American Civil War, and that'll be the last meeting between General Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. We'll have some other cast of characters in there as well, but those are the two primary folks that we talk the most about. So as we start off here from the first day at Fredericksburg, we are going to head out onto Route 3. We're facing to the north right now. We're facing off towards those rivers. If you're looking at the front cameras, if you're looking at me, you're looking to the south. As we ride out here, Route 3 is off to our left. That is the Orange Turnpike. At times, this is both the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road, because the two intersect. And in fact, it became so confusing down here whenever they put the 911 system into place in Spotsylvania County that they had to make sure they differentiated between the two different roads, because this name was so interchangeable. We're heading out here towards the west. Off to our right is the first day at Chancellorsville battlefield. Chancellorsville is a little bit over 1 mile to the front of us. And as we dip down here, we're going into the Lick Run Valley. We sometimes call this first day at Chancellorsville. Internally, we call it FDAC, but we sometimes call it the Lick Run battlefield. And Lick Run is down here along modern day Route 3.
Chris, one of the things that's important about this stream is Confederates would be advancing from our rear toward our front. And as they would try to get across that stream, it's something that's going to break up their cohesion. So as they try to kind of splash through and they have to get back in line, it's something that really causes some problems for them as they're making their assault against the Federals off in this direction.
Yeah, and as we come up on top of this hill, this is what we call McGee Hill. I call it McGee Ridge because it's more of a ridge line than a hill. But in 1863, off to our left in the median would have been a small structure, the Newton House. We don't know much about that, but off to our front right would have been the house of Absalom McGee. He's one of 3 McGees who would have lived in this area. This would have been a neighborhood of sorts if you were out here in 1863. You would have had Reuben McGee. You would have had Absalom McGee. You would have had another McGee out here. You would have had down the road the Zoan Church, which is today near the Home Depot. You would have also had the McCarty House, which would have been where basically the Home Depot is today.
Janis Joplin and Bobby McGee?
Bobby McGee, of course. We always have to work in Janis Joplin. You also had Ann Lewis's house. You would have had one of the Alsups. I think it was Joseph Alsup's house out in this have So you would have had a lot of people living here. These would have mostly been subsistence farmers. Hard for me to say with my fake tooth. And they would have been out here, you know, earning a living. Most of them don't own slaves. Most of them are out here are poor dirt farmers, as we would think of them. What we've now done is actually made a left off of Route 3, the Orange Turnpike, and we are now on McLaws Drive. We're in Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. Off to our right will be the west, and that will be the Chancellorsville area. Down straight ahead of us is the south. We're heading towards the Lee Jackson bivouac site. And this area would have been Lee's central position during the Battle of Chancellorsville. A lot of people make a big deal out of the flank attack here at Chancellorsville. I think it's a little bit overblown personally, because it leaves Lee's army in a terrible position. But to bring us to April 30th, May 1st, 1863, Lee has moved his army out into this direction, specifically under his de facto second in command, Stonewall Jackson. Jackson's troops establish a line in Zoan Church Ridge. They will then push forward on 2 parallel roads, the Orange Plank Road, which we'll cross here momentarily, and the Orange Turnpike. They will be coming down these roads, push Hooker back. Off of this high ground, which will point us off towards Chancellorsville, out towards the west. If you ever heard of the quip from George Gordon Meade saying, if he can't hold the top of a hill, how does he expect to hold the bottom of the hill? We're on the top of the hill. The bottom of the hill is just out in front of us, and he would have been referring to McGee Ridge. This ridge line is going to give Lee cover and concealment to mass Jackson's 31,000 or so men so that they can make that flank attack, which we'll talk about in this video as well as another video. And what he is also going to be able to do is bring reinforcements back to this point from Fredericksburg. Remember, at this point, Lee's army will be broken up into two pieces. One is at Fredericksburg under Jubal Anderson Early, his bad old man. Then we have a gap of about 10 miles till we get to about where we are. Then we will have Lee break his army into another piece, and that'll be Stonewall Jackson marching out and around us, and he will launch an attack about 4 miles to the west directly in front of us on the Union right flank. So we have 3 different pieces of the Confederate Army at one point, and that doesn't even include Jeb Stuart, who's off doing his own thing for a while. So now what Lee has to do is have a central position so people know where he is. He also can use this position for cover and concealment to move Jackson. Early can fall back this position if he needs to. Jackson can fall back to here, but most importantly, Lee can also fall back to the south. When people talk about the flank attack here at Chancellorsville, they talk about this audacious movement, and it is a calculated risk. I think that's the best way of putting it. And what Lee will end up doing is always making sure that his army has an escape route. Jubal Early at Fredericksburg will be able to hinge his force on a place called Prospect Hill and fall back towards Spotsylvania Courthouse or towards Robert E. Lee.
I'm going to lean in here just a second, Chris, because as we can see forest in front of us, the woods at the time would have been even thicker than this. For a second ago, we were looking across that field here at McLaw's Wedge. That would have been wooded at the time. It's wonderful that it's open now because now you can see the terrain and how you've got all these dips. You got these streamlets that run through it. Men get lost out in there. And so it's a really confusing spot, but we've got a really good interpretive opportunity here to really kind of take a look at what the landscape looked like.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this landscape, again, to really fully understand, as we've talked about in other videos, a battle, you have to get out on the ground, you have to walk the ground for yourself and analyze the movements and the decisions that the commanders are making. But the ground out here on McLaw's Trail is really very similar to the ground that we just visited or we were at in an earlier video. It's very undulating, which is interesting just to get a sense of how the terrain is here just to the east of Chancellorsville and why it was so important for Hooker to try to get out of the wilderness, clear this dense secondary growth forest so he can bring his numbers and his artillery to bear. Now, going back to what Chris mentioned earlier, talking about the families that lived west of Fredericksburg, what's interesting about those families, not only are they dirt poor farmers, but there's also a fairly strong Union sentiment running through the community here around Chancellorsville, to the point where after Joseph Hooker takes command, he establishes what is called the BMI, the Bureau of Military Information. It's an intelligence arm of the Army of the Potomac, forerunners to modern FBI and CIA, and they're the head of the BMI, George Sharp, is actually getting information, having information sent across the Rappahannock River from the rear of the Confederate Army, from the families out here in this area. He has operatives in the rear of the Confederate Army that he is communicating with on a fairly regular basis.
So out in this area, we're heading to the south, heading almost to Lee Jackson bivouac site. Lee will have the opportunity, if he's attacked on this position, his men would be facing off to my right out towards the west to fall back towards the area of Gordonsville or Spotsylvania County as well. He always has an escape route out here, as does Stonewall Jackson. If he's caught on the flank march, he will have an opportunity to fall back. But the Union Army still could pick this Confederate Army apart in 3 distinct pieces. Now, Lee would have been very prominent up on this ridgeline. We've seen a lot of him. We'd also seen Lafayette McLaws, as he is known in Georgia. McLaws is a West Point graduate of the class of 1842. He comes out here. He's the division commander. His division probably fights the most at Chancellorsville, if you ask me. And he, when he comes out here at one point, he needs to get a better view. So he goes to one of those houses, the house of Absalom McGee. I'm thinking about someone from my hometown. Absalom Baird is a Union general. McGee's house, and they push the general up onto the roof of one of the buildings so he can get a better view while he's out there. We're also going to see with him artillery. Artillery would have been up here. This would have been some of the guns of McLaws's batteries, and the artillery actually would have been tucked in the wood line along the left side of McLaw's Drive. They would push their muzzles out to the edge of the wood line, fire, and let the recoil come back in, load the guns under cover, push them back out. So they're using the crest of this ridge line, very important for the gunners. And one last story has to do with Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, the dogs. There's a dog with the troop Georgia Artillery up here named Robert E. Lee. He's apparently a great coward and will hide behind a tree anytime a battle comes about. And they talked about him being a shirker that they had picked up. But the battery loved this dog so much. They also had another dog named Stonewall Jackson. And this dog would run up and down the line barking at anyone. And when the battery had to shift positions, which it did a few times during this battle, someone would grab the dog. They said they normally had to dive in and tackle the dog because he would kind of scamper away, and throw him into a limber chest where you carry the ammunition. They'd stuff him in there, they move to a new position, they'd spring him free, and he'd go running around again. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what happened to Stonewall Jackson. We know Lee survived the war, Lee the dog. Stonewall Jackson, we think, survived the war, but the Louisiana Tigers, under Harry Hayes, stole the dog multiple times and finally absconded with the dog sometime in 1863, and the troop artillery never saw him again. So we're going to jump out here at the Lee Jackson bivouac site, talk about the real Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Okay, so we've jumped out of the car, and now we are at tour stop number 5 at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, specifically the Chancellorsville unit, and we are right at an intersection, as you can tell, and this is the intersection of the Orange Plank Road, which is just where that van went to, as well as McLaw's Drive today. We call that the Furnace Road in 1863. This is one of the most important intersections in the Chancellorsville area. The most important intersection is the Chancellorsville Crossroads, which is where Joe Hooker's headquarters is located, just about a mile from where we're standing. And here we are again. We drove down this road, we went right past through here, and now we're at the Lee Jackson bivouac site. Why do we call that? This is where Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee will meet on the evening of May 1st into the morning of May 2nd, and then they will have their final meeting close to this area as Stonewall Jackson marches off on his flank attack here at Chancellorsville. It's a really interesting area. We're going to bring some folks on to talk about, but one of the things we have out here is one of the 10 monuments that were placed out here are markers by James Power Smith. These markers are actually very, very tall. This is very deeply buried into the ground. And on this side of it, it'll say Lee Jackson Bivouac. It's a little bit out of in the sun right now. You won't be able to see it. But a New Yorker actually pays to put these in, about $250 a piece, and he'll place them around 10 spots on the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park battlefields. Before this was a national military park. So we'll see things at Prospect Hill at Fredericksburg. We'll see one of these. We'll see one at Lee's headquarters along Mine Road near Fredericksburg. We have one here. We have one at Salem Church, and we have others at places like Spotsylvania Courthouse and the Stonewall Jackson death site, once known as the Stonewall Jackson Shrine. And this is one of those markers that's out here. There's another one I know Chris Mackwoski wants to talk about. And without further ado, I want to bring on the greatest living apostle of Stonewall Jackson. And that will be Chris Mackwoski. Usually when we talk about him, especially around the anniversary of Jackson's death on May 10th, 1863, tears, he's lighting candles. There's usually carnations and roses laid out in places. So Chris, I hope that you brought your hanky with you.
Just the thought of what's about to happen is stirring me deep inside. This has really become one of the most iconic spots in all of Civil War history because it's really one of the birthplaces of the Lost Cause myth. What's about to happen with the Confederate commanders here is really going to influence the way we tell the story of the Civil War for 160 years. And you're going to have the great Confederate chieftain, the great Confederate martyr. They're going to have their final meeting in this spot, and we'll talk a little bit about how that ties into the mythology in just a second. To play off what Chris was talking about with orientation, off to my right, we're going to see the Old Plank Road. This is where one of the spears of Hooker's advance march down in that direction under Henry Slocum, the 12th Corps, and when they fall back, they're going to come from my left to my right, leaving detritus in their wake. Confederates are going to take advantage of some of that detritus, including some abandoned cracker boxes, as they then come and fill in that gap. So we're going to have Confederates coming down that road in pursuit of the Federals. They're also going to be coming in along the turnpike where we were driving earlier, and they're going to begin to fill in along this ridge, McGee Ridge, as Chris has talked about. So this is when Jackson and Lee finally are able to get together, able to confer about the day's events and what they might be able to do next. Now, of course, we know that Lee's been reacting to Hooker, waiting for Hooker to make the first moves of this. But then when Lee came out, met Hooker on the battlefield, Hooker surrenders the initiative. And that's the one card that Lee is always looking to play. And so when he confers with Jackson here in this spot, they're going to talk about what they can do to then take the fight to Joe Hooker. To talk about that, I'm going to ask my friend Don Fons to come on here. Don is a former historian here at Spotsylvania, or Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, and he's got some great stories to share with us. Don is one of my mentors, one of Chris's mentors, has done a tremendous amount for us to help us develop as historians, was instrumental in the publication of our first book, Chancellorsville's Forgotten Front, about the battles of 2nd Fredericksburg and Salem Church. And I'll ask Don to come on in here. And Don, as the Confederates are getting together and trying to figure out what their next move is, what are some of the options that they have available?
Well, in those days, there were really only three options. You could attack the enemy on the left, you could attack them on the right, or you could attack them straight down the center. Center attacks, of course, were usually pretty costly, and especially here at Chancellorsville, Lee could not afford a lot of casualties because he was already so heavily outnumbered. So that left pretty much the right flank and the left flank. Earlier on May the 1st, Lee had taken the opportunity to go out and personally do a reconnaissance of the right flank area up closer to the Rappahannock River, and he had found that that was not a possible point of attack because there are very, very steep ravines and gullies there, which would have made it very difficult for his troops to negotiate. So that really only left one other flank, and that was the Union right flank, or Lee's left flank, over in this direction. And that was being patrolled by Jeb Stuart's cavalry. And that evening, Jeb Stuart came back to the intersection here where Lee and Jackson were and gave them good news. And that was that the Union right flank was, to use his term, up in the air. In other words, it wasn't resting on any stream or mountain or other natural obstacle. It was just kind of dangling out there, almost asking to be hit. Well, that obviously was the spot that Lee and Jackson wanted to attack. The question was, could they attack it? To do so, they're going to need to get their troops from here all the way around to that right flank, a good 10, 12 mile distance, all in the course of a single day, and get there in time to make the attack. They couldn't march so close to the Union line as to be seen, yet they couldn't march so far away as to make it take more than that one day's time. So the question was, were there roads that fit those requirements? Surprisingly, Lee didn't know. What was Lee's background? He was an engineer. Engineers like roads and things, and maps, but Lee surprisingly had not had any maps made of this area during the entire preceding winter. So he had to now figure out where the roads were. And to do that, he's going to take Stonewall Jackson's chaplain, Beverly Tucker Lacey, who had been a minister in this area, knew some of the people who lived here. And he's also going to send Jackson's topographical engineer, Jed Hotchkiss, and they're going to ride down the road to talk with a guy named Charles Welford. Welford ran the big furnace that we'll be seeing a little bit later on. And so he knew all the roads in this area. And he's going to show these two gentlemen a way that Jackson can get his forces from here all the way around to attack the Union right flank. So with this news, Jed Hotchkiss is now going to come back here to the intersection, wake up Lee and Jackson, and sitting on one of those cracker boxes that Chris just talked about, they're going to sit down and over this fire begin looking at this map that Hotchkiss has now sketched out for them. As Hotchkiss shows them the route they need to take, Lee's going to turn to Jackson and ask rhetorically, what do you intend to do? Jackson, who's very literal-minded, sketched the same route with his finger and said, I'm going to take my troops around here and attack Joe Hooker. And at that point, Lee's going to ask a very important question. He's going to say, what do you intend to make this movement with? In other words, how many men are you going to take with you on this daylight venture? And Jackson, without batting an eye, said, my entire corps, minus, of course, Early's division, which had been left back in Fredericksburg. That was about 30 out of the 45,000 troops that Lee had here at Chancellorsville. That meant that Jackson's going to leave Lee with just 15,000 men to face this unknown horde of Union soldiers. We know now there's more than 70,000 men, and hold them here for a full day while Jackson makes this daylight march through the woods. Even Lee was stunned by the temerity of that suggestion. But after a moment, he said, well, go ahead then. And so Jackson now gleefully gallops on down the road to get his troops ready for this march. The next morning, Jackson's going to come back up here, take a left turn and follow his troops down this road. But before he joins them in this march, he's going to stop here and have a brief meeting with General Lee. We don't know what the two discussed. It was obviously just some last-minute details about this movement. All we do know is that Jackson at one point is going to point his finger toward the head of his column and go galloping off. This will be the last time that Lee and Jackson will ever meet.
And that's why that becomes such a moment rich in possibility. What did they say? What happens? And of course, history knows what's going to happen. And so that just makes this a pregnant moment with possibilities, imagery, symbolism. I want to kind of do one of my favorite things and create a human map here for a second to illustrate why that flank is so important. So I'm going to get all of the folks who have joined us here. Tim Talbot from Central Virginia Battlefield Trust. I'm going to ask you to stand right here next to Don Fonz. I'm going to ask Dan Davis to come on in here and join as well. We have all the way from the West Coast, Susan Byerly is joining us. And I'm going to leave Sarah K. Byerly behind the camera. Susan, why don't you come here? Dan, close up ranks. Stand right next to Don. Here's why a flank is so important. If I'm going to attack these guys, let's say they're the Federals, I'm the way outnumbered Confederates, and I just attack frontally. How many of you guys can be shooting at me right now? See, oh, look at them, and they're like double-barreled. I'm totally getting it here. But if I come to the flank and I attack, now how many of you can shoot at me? Okay. At the point of contact, it's one-on-one. I still have to fight all four of them, but I can do it one at a time. So that's why, as they're looking at the vulnerabilities of the Federal position, which is behind Sarah and the camera right now, they identify the flank as being that key area that Don mentioned, because at the point of contact, it's only one-on-one, and that's going to allow Lee to take advantage of his ability to surprise and attack and not get overwhelmed by those numbers. I'm going to ask Dan Davis to come on here. He's going to do the famous American Battlefield Trust microphone switch with Don Fonz and come on here and talk just a few moments. After that, we're going to pitch it over to Sarah to talk a little bit about the importance of staff work, because that really is what's going to provide the intelligence that these two Confederate commanders need to figure out this plan. Dan?
Thanks, Chris. Chris has talked a lot about symbolism, about the lost cause mythology, about memory here. And it's really from this point in time, this moment, on the night of May 1st, into the early morning hours of May the 2nd, 1863, that we really look at through this lens at Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Fast forward a little bit and try not to give away too much of a story or another story I'm about to tell. Lee will ultimately divide his army 3 times here at Chancellorsville. We will know this battle conventionally as Lee's greatest victory here on this field. It gives him the momentum that he needs after the Battle of Fredericksburg to launch a second Northern invasion. And this is through the lens, this is how we view Robert E. Lee. We view him here at Chancellorsville, this great victory that he has. And we essentially, I think he's lifted up as this great strategic and tactical commander. Well, let's flip the script a little bit. There's another engagement that takes place some 13 years later after this battle, out west in the Montana Territory, where an officer in the United States Cavalry will divide his army divide his force not once, twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. And he is soundly defeated by the Sioux and Northern Cheyenne on June 25th, 1876. Now, had George Custer been a little bit more successful, and comparing him to Robert E. Lee, how would we, after both commanders divide their army or divide their forces multiple times against a superior foe, how would we view Custer today had he been victorious? How would we view Lee today had he lost this battle to Joseph Hooker? And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Byerly. Sarah?
Thanks, Dan, for sharing those observations. And I just wanted to jump in and talk a little bit about staff officers, because we're here at the Lee Jackson bivouac site. And you know, some of the things that the others have been sharing about what we know of Lee and Jackson's meeting, it's recorded by staff officers, some in their journals, others in their post-war writings. And I think it's important that we keep in mind that we talk about Lee, we talk about Jackson, and we talk about these orders that they put into motion, but who's actually helping to put those orders into motion? Because Jackson doesn't go and talk to all of his division commanders and give them all those little details at one time. He's going to have his staff officers taking those messages, giving them to couriers, getting ready for this march, and then you're going to have staff officers playing a role on the march. And this is true on any Civil War battle, any Civil War battlefront campaign planning. You've got the generals making the decisions, but then you have their staff helping to carry it out. So this could be their adjutant generals, you have their supply officers, ones that are making sure that there's enough ammunition coming up. You have the engineers, Jed Hotchkiss was mentioned, Jackson's map maker. We have Reverend Tucker Lacey, who's on Jackson's staff as a chaplain, who brings his knowledge of the area right here to this spot. And I think it's just interesting to keep that in mind, that we talk about Lee, we talk about Jackson, we talk about Hooker, and keep in mind that there's a lot of people around their headquarters helping them carry out these huge decisions that they're making. And touching back to the concept of memory, we have these staff officers who are recording either at the time or later their memories of the events, and that really ties into how we understand some of those moments of decision, whether it's Hooker at the Chancellor House or Lee and Jackson here. Chris?
Why am I not surprised? I walk over to reset the cameras and I come back and Dan Davis is talking about George Custer. Chris is behind the camera crying. To add into what Sarah had to say about staff officers, yeah, they do a lot out here, but they're also not doing a lot of other things. They're also creating problems. Robert Chilton is one of the worst staff officers in any army of any war. And out here at Chancellorsville, he is going to misinterpret Robert E. Lee's orders, which he's done before on other battlefields, and nearly cost them the Fredericksburg sector during the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, which we'll talk about in another video. We'll also have a General Van Allen, who's only been on Hooker's staff for 10 days, who's at the Chancellor House whenever Joe Hooker is wounded on May 3rd, giving away part of the story later on. And Van Allen is not taking the lead while he is there because he's a political general. He's not a West Pointer. He's not helping to make decisions while Joe Hooker is severely concussed. He's not helping to bring in the second in command of the Army, Darius Couch, to take over for Hooker, who needed to give up or relinquish his command. And then we have Dan Butterfield, who I liken to Frank Burns from MASH. He is a guy who, if you read Marcina Patrick's diary, he's the provost marshal of the Army of the Potomac. Think of him as the military police. He's also described as the greatest living fossil of the Cenozoic era, so he's kind of a crusty old guy. He is going to claim that whenever Hooker left the Army to go up to Washington over the winter of 1862-63, that anytime that happens, that Butterfield would come in and hold as many meetings as possible, puff out his chest, and try to be that important guy. And it always reminded me of a episode in season 5 whenever Frank decided to move the camp from one side of the road to the other just because he could, because Colonel Potter was away. Butterfield, by the way, is just not a nice guy on top of things. But he's not here. He's actually stationed over in Falmouth. And whenever the President of the United States start to ask questions on May 3rd, where's Sedgwick? What's up with Hooker? What's going on there? Butterfield will deflect rather than giving the Commander-in-Chief all the information he needs. So the staff officers are important, but they're also someone we have to be very wary of after the war. Think of the show Entourage on HBO. The only reason why all of those guys have any sort of touch or claim to fame is because of Vinny. Because Vinny's the guy who's going on Aquaman, the first movie, not the one with Jason Momoa. All these other ones, these guys are tied to Stonewall Jackson's fame. They're tied to Robert E. Lee, to Joseph Hooker. And whenever their star rises, so does their fame. And whenever it falls, so does theirs. So some of the early biographers of Stonewall Jackson are former staff officers. You have to take all of what they have to say with about a pound of salt. Because remember, what they're saying about Jackson may have been true, but a lot of times it was embellished. And that's not just about Jackson. That happens about a lot of them. Dan Butterfield will do the same thing. So as we stand out here, those are some things to remember. I can see Chris Mackwoski is ready to Gustavus Smith me and bust onto the camera and bring something to us. But remember, these guys, this is their lives out here depend on what the decisions that Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson make, on the Confederate side and on the Union side. And then sometimes those decisions are going to be put upon the shoulders of junior officers who are sometimes very competent in the staff roles and other times not very competent.
Actually, that's a perfect segue, Chris. Thank you. Because we talk about Dan Butterfield in the back. He's now starting to shift federal troops into this sector of the battlefield from over in Fredericksburg. The decoy over there has done its job. Now Hooker needs those men on this battlefield. They're going to play into our story here in just a little bit. And when he talks about how the fame of these men is tied to the fame of their commanders, that's the reason why this spot in particular has become so influential, because they're all looking back and thinking about how important this spot is and how important this moment is. I'm going to ask my friend Don Fons to come back here in just a minute to talk a little bit about that, because as you walk on this landscape, not only do we have the Smith Monument that Chris mentioned, but if we take a look over here, we have a pair of cedar trees, we have a plaque in the ground, and these are also part of the effort to memorialize this moment, this last meeting. There are some waysides that address the story as well. And Don, as someone who worked for the park as a historian, tell us a little bit about how the park's history ties into the memorialization of this spot.
Well, this, again, is a key spot. It was recognized as such from its earliest days. And eventually, it took several years after the park was created, but eventually the park acquired this corner and this piece of land. And Douglas Southall Freeman was even brought out here to give a great speech in which hundreds of people attended. And so at that time, one of the park historians, a very talented man named Ralph Happel, he decided that that the park staff should commemorate this spot and also the event that had just taken place here. So he conferred with some of his fellow employees, and they decided they would buy a small plaque to put here at the last meeting site, again, to commemorate the importance of the site, and also the fact that they had planted 2 cedar trees here, again, to kind of recreate the grove of trees that would have been here when Lee and Jackson were here. So with that in mind, he got his co-workers to agree to chip in on this project. Happel went out and bought this nice little plaque here, which they affixed to a stone. And at that point, he went back to his colleagues and asked them for their share of the contribution, only to find out that several of them had excuses for why they suddenly could not contribute to the cause. Happel, with understandable disgust, would later write in his history of the park about this incident and concluded, "They serve as well who cannot collect."
Yeah, Don, I think it's important too that we talk about, you know, this is almost 20% of all the markers and monuments on the battlefield at Chancellorsville right here. There are only about 9 real monuments on the battlefield out here. Salem Church, if you put that off to the side in 2nd Fredericksburg, they have 5 monuments. So that battle over there, you know, has almost as many as the larger battle here. And it's important to remember this park's not founded until 1927. As a national military park, and whenever they were leading up to creating Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, Congress did a study, and they sent an officer down here who said, we only need to save 1,500 acres of these 4 battlefields, Fredericksburg, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Chancellorsville, and by the way, we shouldn't save anything at Chancellorsville. And then they went back and kind of looked at this and said, no, we can do 2,500 acres and we can save a little bit at Chancellorsville. So since the 1920s, we've been working forward. And Douglas Southall Freeman's important because he was a preservationist too. He helped buy part of the Widow Tap Field for us. And if you go through the park files, you can see the superintendent at the time like, hey man, can you send us the check? Hey, can you send us that check? Hey, you remember that money you were going to give us? Yeah, we need that to buy the land. So it's interesting to see what we have out here. And, you know, one of the early places they want to memorialize and interpret is here. But you know, most likely, as we've talked some of us in the past, and I don't know what your thought is, but most likely the last meeting didn't take place where we're standing. It probably took, or the Cracker Box meeting probably took place over there where everyone's trying to shuffle through my camera shot. So it's right across over there because we're on the business side of McGee Hill rather than the safe side of it. So we've had conversations. What are your thoughts, Don? Do you think took place over there, here? Does it really matter? It's the intersection.
Again, it's one of those things that I don't know if anybody will ever really know. Again, is it one of the corners of the intersection, and how they chose this one specifically, at this point I can no longer remember. But again, does it really make a difference? To purists, perhaps it does. But again, to history in general, as long as we know that this general vicinity was where it happened, that's probably enough.
Yeah, to quote Tim Smith of the East, it was over there. That's how he will put things whenever he generalizes. So I always love that one. So with that, we want to actually pick up the next part of the story in our next video, and that is going to be the famed flank attack of Stonewall Jackson. We're going to follow the route from start to finish. So we're going to jump out at a few spots. We're going to be in the car going along. And along the way, you can follow us on Facebook, you can follow us on Twitter as well as YouTube, but check out our Battle of Chancellorsville app. You can go over to Google Play Store or over to not Amazon, iTunes, trying to think about where we have it, and you can download that for free. We have Bob Crick, who's the former chief historian here at the park, who is featured on that battle app, and he'll take you around the park virtually and help to support what we're doing out here right now. So I really want to thank you for watching, for supporting battlefield preservation. Check out battlefields.org. And for everybody out here in our gaggle, we got Chris Mackwoski back there lighting a candle. We got Dan Davis trying to figure out how he's going to work Custer into the next stop. He will, believe me. I know how he does it. We've got Don Fawns, Sarah Byerly behind the camera, Tim Talbot, Central Virginia Battlefield Trust. I'm Kris White. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education.